5 psychological techniques Napoleon used to control people. History isn't just written by the guys who win with swords or cannons. It's written by those who know how to dive into the dark alleys of the human mind and use people's weaknesses as weapons. Napoleon Bonaparte, stepping out from the rugged cliffs of Corsica to turn all of Europe into his personal chessboard, was way more than just a military genius. He was a flawless master of psychology who could see the thinnest cracks in human nature. He figured out early on that humans aren't rational creatures. Instead, they're simple mechanisms driven by their fears, their endless pride, their hunger for validation, and their desperate need to belong. Once he knew exactly which buttons to push, he turned massive armies and veteran politicians into direct extensions of his own will. The crowds he faced were basically a hypnotized mob, willingly bowing down to him. Now, we are going to break down the 5 ruthless, boundary-pushing psychological techniques this great commander and emperor used to manipulate, control, and gladly send people to their deaths for his own vision. 1. Fake intimacy and the illusion of personal importance. One of the deepest secrets of leadership and crowd control is the ability to make every single person in a massive crowd feel like they are the absolute center of the universe. The human mind is incredibly hungry for validation, for being noticed and appreciated. When a person, who deep down knows they are just an ordinary cog in a giant machine with millions of other gears, is led to believe that the supreme mastermind of the system knows them personally, it creates the strongest bond of loyalty imaginable. Napoleon exploited this weakness with surgical precision. In an era where an ordinary foot soldier was seen as nothing more than a disposable pawn, making that soldier believe his emperor knew his past, his scars, and his family was processed in the soldier's mind as a divine blessing. People don't just sacrifice themselves for their country or a few bucks. They fight for a leader's ego if that leader validates their existence and makes them feel like they aren't just a nobody. Napoleon collected data like a human AI algorithm, memorizing the names, home villages, and specific battle details of soldiers across armies of thousands. He would take this intel, gathered beforehand from his officers, and stage it with incredible naturalness, as if he was just remembering it on the spot. In reality, this was a cold-blooded, pragmatic, and highly calculated investment strategy. Giving a few seconds of emotional reward, the privilege of calling someone by their name, bought absolute devotion from that person and the hundreds of others witnessing it. When you're at the absolute peak of power, a small smile thrown downwards creates a revolution in the world of an ordinary man. Example. Picture this. On a freezing winter morning, while inspecting his army, Napoleon suddenly stops walking. He approaches an ordinary infantryman standing in the ranks, looks him dead in the eye, puts a hand on his shoulder, and says, "Weren't you on the left flank of that brave battalion holding the bridge at the Battle of Rivoli? How's that bullet wound on your shoulder? Is your dad still running that little bakery in Lyon?" The soldier, standing in a massive imperial army of hundreds of thousands, simply can't believe that the ruler of Europe remembers him. His knees go weak, and he bursts into tears. But the reality was completely different. Just 20 minutes before this inspection, Napoleon had taken a list of veterans and their personal details from the unit's commander. He memorized this information just like an actor memorizing his lines. This tiny, carefully crafted theatrical scene was a flawless psychological illusion that guaranteed that infantryman, and the entire battalion watching in awe, would throw themselves onto enemy bayonets without a second thought at Napoleon's single command. 2. Institutionalizing pride and greed, benefit-driven loyalty. The ultimate shortcut to absolute control over people is feeding their dark ambitions, their pride, and their hunger for status. You have to sell them the dream of a title they desperately want to reach. Let's be honest, people generally don't act out of high virtues, abstract ideals, or pure goodness. They act for their own interests, their position in society, their desire to be better than others, and the shiny medals they can hang around their necks. Napoleon quickly managed to turn the old wind of equality brought by the French Revolution completely in his favor. Under the guise of merit, he created a brand new aristocracy built entirely on pride. He perfectly analyzed how hungry people were for rewards they could earn with their own sweat, blood, and obedience, rather than titles they were simply born with. If you just give a man orders, he'll do the bare minimum, just enough to avoid getting punished. But if you promise him a rank, a special uniform, or a flashy badge to pin on his chest, that man will push his limits, crush his rivals, and risk his life for that piece of tin. Napoleon's legendary quote, "Every French soldier carries a marshal's baton in his knapsack," is the perfect summary of this deep manipulation. He injected his soldiers with the illusion that they could rise from the absolute lowest ranks, from being an ordinary peasant, all the way to the highest command. Ambition, when managed smartly, is the most destructive and yet the most loyal power in a leader's hands. Stroking people's egos and handing out symbols that make them feel elite is the cheapest and most guaranteed way to buy their obedience. The Legion of Honor system, built by Napoleon's own hands, is one of the most successful ego and pride manipulations in history. After the old aristocracy based on bloodlines was destroyed, Napoleon filled this massive power vacuum with medals he designed himself, keeping the authority to distribute them exclusively in his own hands. When the tough, idealistic old commanders of the Revolution looked down on this new medal system and called them childish toys, Napoleon gave them this historic, cold-blooded, and highly pragmatic response: "You are right, they are toys. But it is with toys that men are led." In exchange for a few grams of metal and a few inches of red ribbon, hundreds of thousands of smart, strong men considered dying all over Europe for Napoleon's personal ambitions to be the absolute highest honor of their lives. This is the clearest proof of how human psychology can be hacked. 3. Controlled unpredictability and power imbalance. If your subordinates or your enemies can predict your next move, how you'll react, or what your mood will be, you're no longer in control. They are managing you. The golden rule to making your authority unshakable is to always stay behind a thick veil of mystery and keep everyone around you in a constant state of psychological imbalance. To protect his power, Napoleon never fully revealed what he was actually thinking to his commanders and ministers. One day he would praise a general to the skies, treating him like the greatest genius of the empire, and the very next day, he could ruthlessly criticize that same general in front of everyone over a tiny mistake, crushing him completely. These sudden mood swings weren't a sign of weakness or instability. They were a consciously applied mechanism of psychological terror. When people don't know exactly when they'll get a massive reward or when they'll have their heads chopped off, they live in a constant state of high alert, tension, and a desperate eagerness to please the leader. This fog of uncertainty absolutely prevents subordinates from getting comfortable, teaming up, and forming any conspiracies against the boss. Because in that chaotic environment, everyone is solely focused on protecting their current position and making sure they aren't the pawn sacrificed in the next move. Napoleon played a literal game of chess with the emotional states of his elite circle just to make them toxically dependent on him. By always hiding his true intentions, he kept both his rivals and his own men constantly on the defensive. Authority only produces absolute obedience when it's mixed with a heavy dose of fear and unpredictability. Foreign Minister Talleyrand and Minister of Police Fouch were the two most powerful, cunning, and dangerous men of the Napoleonic era. Under normal circumstances, it would have been incredibly easy for these two masterminds of intrigue to team up and undermine Napoleon. But Napoleon saw this potential threat miles away. To break their power, he constantly pitted them against each other. One day he would order Talleyrand to secretly investigate and report on Fouch. Later that same evening, he would instruct Fouch to read Talleyrand's letters and have him followed. During council meetings, he would suddenly shower one with compliments and treat him like a confidant, while completely turning his back on the other. Thanks to these unpredictable, manipulative tactics, these two massive figures of the empire spent all their energy and intelligence trying to destroy each other. They could never form a united, solid front against Napoleon. He was the ultimate crisis manager who created chaos with his own hands and stayed at the top by feeding off of it. 4. The strategic contrast of grandeur and simplicity, the power of image. Power isn't just an economic or military fact that exists on paper. Power is also a theatrical performance staged to manage perceptions. But contrary to popular belief, this staging isn't always done with glittering gold, blinding jewels, and flashy clothes. True masters of manipulation and branding use the incredibly striking power of contrast. While Napoleon dressed everyone around him in the most exaggerated, flashy uniforms, with gold braiding, giant epaulets, and feathers, turning them into showbirds, he was always the most simply dressed man on the battlefield and in the palace. This was an incredibly arrogant but brilliantly crafted display of power. He was sending a clear, ruthless message to the world. My authority and status aren't defined by the silk fabrics, gold medals, or flashy shapes I wear. They are defined by my very existence, by my mind. While his generals strutted around like peacocks, he would stand quietly among them in his famous, worn-out grey overcoat and unpretentious hat. In a crowded room or a chaotic battlefield, the human eye, guided by the subconscious, would immediately be drawn to this simple, contrasting figure. This visual contrast was the most powerful, silent way of telling his subordinates, "You get your power from these uniforms, from these shapes I gave you, but the real power is inside me, in my brain." On the tense morning of the Battle of Austerlitz, the staff officers had gathered in front of the imperial tent to get their final orders. Cavalry commander Murat stood there like a walking, breathing fortune, with his dazzling gold-embroidered tunic, a giant feather hat, a diamond-hilt sword, and shining boots. The other marshals weren't far behind in this show-off contest. Right then, the tent flap opened, and Napoleon stepped out. He was wearing his worn, dusty old green colonel's uniform with absolutely no rank insignias or medals, and his famous grey military coat. At that moment, all those flashy, gold-covered generals bowed in deep respect before this incredibly simple man, like wheat stalks bending in a wind. When the soldiers at the front saw not the fancy generals, but that simple man in the grey coat, they shook the earth shouting, "Long live the Emperor!" By wearing practically nothing special, Napoleon had visually proven to the whole world that the essence of power isn't in the wrapping, and that he was superior, and more dangerous, than everyone else in the room. 5. Creating a sacred enemy. Internal control through external threat. The fastest, most unshakable, and most manipulative way to bind a massive crowd, a giant organization, or a crumbling nation tightly together isn't to offer them a bright vision to achieve. It's to give them a common enemy they will fear and hate to their very core. People are slow and reluctant to rally around positive ideals or make sacrifices, but when it comes to uniting against a common enemy that triggers their survival instincts, they are incredibly aggressive and fast. To instantly silence the political cracks within France, the endless economic crises, and the growing opposition against him, Napoleon never forgot to keep a foreign boogeyman on the horizon. The argument, "If we don't stand together as one fist behind me, British gold and Russian bayonets will come, loot your homes, and take away all the rights the French Revolution won," was his greatest psychological weapon that got him through every crisis. He always packaged his aggressive, insatiable expansionist policies and endless wars, where hundreds of thousands died, as a necessary defense and for the survival of France. When the justified arrows of criticism directed at a leader from the inside are deliberately turned toward a bloody monster created on the outside, the leader stops being a dictator and rises to the position of the nation's sole savior. In the early 1800s, when Republicans and Royalists were about to slit each other's throats on the streets of France, when the economy was shaking, and when voices of objection against Napoleon's one-man rule were getting louder, he made a master maneuver and instantly shifted the focus to England. Using the press and propaganda at full capacity, he launched the perfidious Albion, treacherous England, narrative. He made headlines in every newspaper claiming that the British weren't just out to sink the French Navy, but were making dark plans to steal the freedom of the French people, the bread of their children, and their future. When peace broke down, he blamed the destruction and misery entirely on these foreign powers. Suddenly, political opponents at home fell into the category of traitors, separatists, or British agents. He instilled this idea into his people and elites: to criticize me, to break the ranks, is to play right into the enemy's hands. With this ruthless and brilliant move, he reduced all internal rebellions to zero and turned the pure hate of a nation into endless fuel that made his authority invincible.